Hi, my name is Dean Marzufka. I am a retired mental health therapist. Worked in the field for probably 25, 30 years-ish. Um, I'm kind of recovering from my own bouts with depression and anxiety. For about 15 years, I struggled with that. And last but not least, and probably my most important credential, is I'm a Christian. I'm a fellow Christian. And the walk with Christ is the thing that saved me. Out of all the things clinically and whatnot that I engaged in, I think it was the walk with Christ. As I get going, there's some side notes that I want to make abundantly clear. When you listen, I got to be careful with that. When you listen to the presentation, you will hear, if you're depressed, you may hear things like, you should be, or you could have done that better. Because that's what depression does to you. That's what it did to me. And interestingly enough, the example that I'm going to give, I have this sweater, this old wool sweater. It was made in Peru 35 years ago. I still have it to this day. When I bought it, it was oversized. I wish I could say the same thing now. Clearly I can't. It actually fits now. But I love this sweater, right? Before I was depressed, people would compliment me on this sweater, even though I looked, pretty baggy and whatnot in it. People would say, "That's a great sweater. I really like that." And I would hear it for the compliment that it was. When I became depressed and I was suffering from depression and anxiety, people would say the exact same thing to me. And I didn't hear the compliment. I would hear sarcasm. I would hear, "That's not a great sweater." Even though, and we're talking like instantaneously, they'd say, "Hey, that's a really nice sweater." I heard those words. I heard the idea that they're talking about my sweater. But in my head, I instantly translated it to something belittling or something hurtful to me. Did I really hear those words? No, that's a whole different psychiatric diagnosis. I didn't hear the words. I know they didn't say, nice sweater. They didn't say it. They didn't say the words. They didn't have that tone. But that's how I took it. And the reason why that's important to point out in the process of these presentations is that as we discuss things, for me in particular, I will say things, and if you're struggling with depression, you may hear them differently. You may hear a should. You may hear you could do better, or why did you do that? And that's not what I'm saying at all. So I want to make sure that is out there front and center. If you hear something and you're thinking, "Hey, is he messing with me? Is he talking about me, or is this a slight, or I feel like this could be a slight," let me know. I give this presentation to a number of groups, and the more that I know about that, the better I can kind of explain it as I'm in that process, because if it's affecting you that way, it'll probably affect somebody else that way. So please let me know if something kind of hits you and you're like, "Oh, that doesn't sound quite right." Depressive symptoms. We're going to go through the whole thing. It's a quick list, but keep in mind, more days than not. Okay, so depression isn't like a broken leg, where you get a broken leg, the next day you still have a broken leg. Yeah, it's in a cast, it's healing, it's doing its thing, but your leg is still broken. More days than not. This is the confusing part about depression and anxiety, is it's not every day. So one day, and especially loved ones, people that surround you, they're going to say, "How come yesterday you were so crabby, but today you seem happy?" Or quietly in their head, they go, "Oh, they're having a good day." And that is very, very normal. It's recognized as part of the clinical diagnostic criteria, more days than not. So let's get busy and define this. Feelings of sadness, cheerfulness, emptiness, and hopelessness. Yeah, I struggled with all of these things. Most of the time, I would hit that emptiness. That's where my depression really set in. There's a term that, there's a generation that uses it, don't ask me which one, but it's meh, M-E-H, meh. That was my life, meh. I couldn't, it could be the greatest thing in the world that happened to me, and I'd be like, meh. I just couldn't bring around the emotional energy to be anything other than meh. And didn't matter what happened. My kids graduating from school, from college and whatnot, meh. Me getting jobs, meh. Getting a raise, whatever. You know, I just couldn't be happy about anything. Other people struggle with sadness. They use the word tearfulness because as clinicians, frequently you'll hear, I just feel like I want to cry, but I don't know why. And it's undifferentiated, that's the term that's frequently used, and hopelessness. And it kind of attaches to that idea of meh. Angry outburst, irritability, frustration, even over small matters. Okay, so, and again, I'm going to kind of focus on my stuff here. My angry outburst looked like a smart mouth 13-year-old kid, maybe 12. It's somebody who you'd want to, if I allowed it to go out, most of the time I would just get quiet. I just get quiet and try to get away. That was my first strategy of engagement. But if I was stuck in a situation, I'd get rude and mouthy, and people should have slapped me. And I think back on things that I said, and it's like, oh, you know, I try to go back as I remember them, and that's another thing we'll talk about. As I remember the things that I said, I go back and try to apologize to people. What's weird is sometimes they don't remember it, and sometimes they're just being really good Christian Lutheran people and saying, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it, I don't really remember that. And they probably did, because some of the stuff that I said was, I should have been smacked. Loss of interest or pleasure in most or almost or all normal activities such as sex, hobbies, and sports. Yes, that will happen, and that goes back to that meh kind of feeling. These things, as you go through, just think about the amount of energy you have to devote. Think of depression as kind of a pull on the energy that you have. So if you don't have depression and you have a normal day at work, you get home at the end of the day and you kind of like, you know, the couch is looking really good for a nap. You know, you want to kind of nap there. Depression does that to you emotionally. It just takes away the energy. So it's like, yeah, you have this whole list of things that you want to do after you get home from work after a long day, but you just don't have the energy to do it. That's what depression does. It's pulling that energy away. And it just makes things look not that important. It's like, the nap is way better. I just don't want to do it. That happened to me a little bit. Sleep disturbances, including insomnia or sleeping too much. Okay, mine was insomnia. During my depression for 15 years, 14, 15 years, so about 5 years prior to my wife dying, which by the way is 10 years almost to the week. She died on the 17th of April. About 5 years after that, I still had sleep disturbances, and mine manifested itself in insomnia. I could go on 4 hours of sleep. And I got a job shortly after Lori passed. I got a job that allowed me to do that. And not only did they allow me to do that, they paid me handsomely to do it. And so I would get on planes at, midnight, land someplace, sleep on the plane, land someplace, and do whatever it is that I needed to do because I could sleep on the plane. And now I had the rest of the day. Some people are like, oh, I wish I could do that. No, you really don't. You really don't wish you could do that. But that's what I did for a better part of a decade and a half. I would just go. That's all I did. And that also kept me from feeling. It kept me from engaging emotionally. It kept me out of so many things because I could just bounce from one place to the other, to next, to next, to next, and not have to deal with what was messing with me. Reduced appetite or weight loss or increased cravings in food and weight gain. Okay, you can all be a therapist here for a minute. Guess which one hit me? Yeah, okay. So for me, if the food didn't come through 2 windows, I didn't recognize it as food. Okay, so that's kind of where I was, and that's how I dealt with basically everything. I was just, okay, I'm hungry, and I would just eat and eat and eat till I was full, and then I'd go again and not sleep, not exercise, other than running down a tarmac on an airport someplace or running around, doing the stuff that I was doing for work. There was no working out, none of that. I literally didn't have the energy to do that. Going for a walk, absolutely no, that just did not happen. So people say, well, one of the ways to fight depression is get out and go for a walk. No, go for a bike ride. Okay, so how I answered that, I used to love to ride bike back in the day, decades ago. So my response to go for a bike ride, I bought an electric bike, by the way, they're amazing. But it's really not a workout. It doesn't count as a workout, so don't put that there. but they are pretty amazing. Slowed thinking, speaking, and body movements. This kind of hit me, especially in the emotional areas, but there's a ton of research out there that shows that, remember those math tests that you took when you were in grade school, the timed ones, 2 plus 2, 3 plus 3, that kind of thing? See how many you can do in 60 seconds. They've shown that people who are depressed score, it takes them much longer to complete the same sheet as to when they're not depressed. Depression slows down that thinking process. It impacts your ability to engage emotionally. Depressed people will have a delayed response to humor. And humor is usually one of those instantaneous things. It takes a while for the information to process. It's not that they're intellectually slow. It's literally the computer's running slow. It's like having 500 tabs open in your Chrome browser. Things are going to slow down. And that's what depression does. Feelings of worthlessness, guilt, fixating on past failures, or self-blame. Wow. Every time. I hate this one. Okay, so this one hit me hard. Lori got cancer. The kids were really little. She struggled with cancer for 15 years and fought an amazing fight. Here's where I messed up. And this is what really opened me up to depression. I thought I could cure cancer. I really did. It wasn't. Yeah. You'd think after 10 years. But okay, so I'm trying to, give me a second. I got to get back in here. Okay, so I thought I could cure cancer. I thought I could save my wife. I couldn't. And here's the key. This is what I did to myself, and it has impact to this day. You're watching it impact me right now. Here was the key. Here was my prayer. My prayer was, Lord, give me strength, give me wisdom, give me love, right? Sounds like a great prayer. And any pastor, had they confronted me, I'd be like, I'm praying a good prayer. This is a righteous prayer. I'm praying for wisdom, strength, and love. These are all good things. But they weren't, because the first two words, give me. I couldn't carry this. I couldn't carry it. I thought I could. And what it ended up doing to me was it broke me emotionally. And I didn't know this was going on because I thought I was praying the right prayer. The prayer I should have been praying is, Lord, this is too heavy. What I've learned out of that since then is I pray that prayer all the time. Everything is too heavy for me. Even things that, in quotes, I think I can do, I end up going, okay, Lord, I'm going to need help. And even that phrase is not quite right, because I'm going to need help. It's like, Lord, please carry this for me, because that's what I should have been doing. But instead, I really thought I could do this. And what it did is it broke me. And it really messed with me. Again, to this day, you saw me kind of trying to struggle through this. That's all part of it. So my depression is much more situational. And you can say, oh, this is what happened. I called it on myself. I didn't understand what I was doing. I look back on it now, it's like, oh yeah, this is where, my prayer should have been much different. My focus should have been much different, because had I said, Lord, please carry this, I wouldn't be thinking that I failed. I'd be looking at it, okay, this is the Lord's plan. It's 10 years out, and I can say that now. So, that's 25 years of carrying that as of today. And hopefully there'll be some more years. Hopefully I can let go of it, but I'm still working on it. Trouble thinking, concentrating, making decisions, and remembering things? Oh yeah. You could show me pictures, especially plus or minus 1 year of Lori dying. I will recognize the pictures. I will recognize everything in there. I will kind of recognize stuff that's going on. And what my mind does very quickly is it tries to create this story. I don't remember a thing of it. My kids will show me, remember this, Dad? Remember we were here, we did this? I don't remember a thing. And so then the kids tell me. And then I go, okay, are you sure? That kind of thing. But yeah, it's that hits. That'll hit. Concentrating is long. I have a background in engineering, computer science, those kinds of things I didn't have a problem with. I could concentrate on those things all day long. Sounds really weird, but as soon as you said, "Hey, how you doing?" I literally would just lock up emotionally and intellectually. I would just freeze. I couldn't even answer that question because it was so hard. Frequent or recurring thoughts of death, suicidal thoughts, suicidal attempts, or suicide. I didn't get into the suicidal thoughts, but thoughts of death, yeah, I thought about that a lot. Thought about Lori's death. I thought about my own death, that I wouldn't struggle. I don't know that I would have resuscitate on my thing if I went to the hospital. I do now, by the way, but back then, no, because it was so painful. And I thought death would be this reprieve and I could go by Christ. But it really wasn't. He had other plans for me. Hopefully, this is part of those plans. But he had other plans for me. But I did not struggle with these things. And I think part of that had to do with my clinical background. I had seen children who lost their parents to suicide. And I had seen the impact that has on the survivors. And it is horrible. It's absolutely horrible for those children to grow up. Even though intellectually they know they didn't cause the suicide, emotionally they struggle with that every day. What role did I play in this? So, unexplained physical problems such as back pain and or headaches. It's interesting, depression in particular, anxiety tends to lock itself basically above C3 and in your head, where the physical problems occur, where it's like headachy, migraines, whereas depression will basically from the eyebrows all the way to the lower back, there's pain. I didn't struggle with this outside of the, weight gain. I didn't struggle with that, but I know lots of people who do. And it's very, very difficult. And it doesn't help, we're the bulk of the folks out of the Wisconsin area. We tend to be German, we tend to be Lutheran, and as such, we want to apply rational thought to this. Oh, it's all in your head. And even if somebody doesn't say that to you, you think it yourself, oh, it's just in my head. It's very real. If they were to put you if you came in presenting with this due to depression, back pains, and headaches, they could put you in the giant donut, as I call it, the MRI, and they could see that you're in pain. They can see it. Now, can they see what's causing it? Not necessarily, but they can actually see, okay, this person is experiencing pain. So they can see it. So it's very real. Okay, let's see. So with all of that said, what I'm going to cover in the next 20 minutes or so, because it's going to be a whirlwind. Design specifications of a human, the primary paths to depression and anxiety, we're going to focus on the social and environmental path. What does the Bible say? And the solutions. So, design. First and foremost, we were not designed to be alone. We were not. And isolation is, the impact that it has on people is staggering. I can't even begin to get into all the details other than to say there's a ton of research out there that shows what isolation does to people. I've worked with inmates who've been put in solitary confinement for 6 months, and yes, they look like human beings, but if you were to talk to them, you would just think there's barely a human in there. You have this person presenting as a child, and their awareness of others, their awareness of self is so diminished. When God said that, and if you think about how important this is, that's the first time God mentions something bad in the Bible. And bad might be a strong word. He says it's not good for man to be alone. And so his response to that should tell us also how important it is. He creates the other half of humanity as a solution to that. So if that doesn't tell you how important and how significant isolation is to the human condition, I don't know what research I can show you that can explain it any better. we were designed for work. And if you'll notice, the easier our lives get, physically, and I am like super lazy. I love finding ways to make things efficient. Like, I used to have a lawnmower that was a robot before they were like really, really popular. And it would mow my lawn for me. And I loved the creativity of it. My wife hated it. Lori hated it because she loved to mow the lawn. And she's like, oh, I hate that thing. And so there was a whole discussion around that. But I was enamored with the tech part of it. She liked the work. She liked to mow the lawn. It gave her a sense of completion, a sense of, doing something. And I hated mowing the lawn. Absolutely hated it. I hate lifting heavy things. So I find all sorts of ways to lift heavy things for me. But we were designed to work. That's what we were designed to do. And the further we get away from it, the worse it is. And it's such an important part of our lives. We actually pay for gym membership to go do work. We literally go lift heavy things in the same place, which makes me crazy on a good day to think that. Not because, one, because it's like so inefficient. It's like you could like be doing actual work, like putting things someplace and doing something with that extra labor. But instead you're just lifting heavy things up and down and up and down. It's okay. There's a whole, I'll just go off into the tangent on that one. But long and the short of it is we're designed to work. And the less work that we do, the worse we are for it. There are two paths to depression, anxiety, two primary paths. One is TBI, traumatic brain injury, and I don't want you to limit your thinking to sports like football players or boxers, that kind of thing, or even just car accidents where it's actual physical head trauma. I want you to open your definition of TBI up because it includes genetic issues, drug use during gestation, all alcohol, chemical exposure, diet and nutrition, and chronic sleep disruption. There's a ton of research, and I didn't know this, that your brain actually changes when you change your sleep cycle. It physically changes. And if you change your sleep cycle long enough, it stays that way. So people who work third shift, there's a ton of research around those folks and how they basically working third shifts knocks off a decade off your life if you work your whole career that third shift. It really, really messes with people. So keep in mind, TBI, it's not just something that happens in sports. There's just a whole litany of ways to get there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because that's a whole different process. Where I want to spend more time is the second of the two paths, and that's causes of mood disorders. And these are the things that affected me, death of a loved one, that really, really messed with me. And her struggle with cancer, 15 years leading up to that. Those things, the chronic stress of that. And then the energy that went into keeping this from the kids, because we had to shield our children from the effects of chemo. And chemo is the worst. It is just the worst, what it does to the body physiologically. So we spent a lot of time shaping the kids' environment, and we homeschooled, so the kids saw her every day. We had to do a lot of things to make sure that the kids didn't experience the worst of it. So there was so much energy that went into that. So chronic stress, traumatic events, and I want to spend a little time on traumatic events because we don't always recognize how impactful they are. And this kind of childhood abuse, I'm going to kind of roll them into one example. Traumatic event. I've worked with children who have suffered sexual abuse at a very, very young age, under the age of 8. Now, what happens when that happens? Okay, the child is removed. Let's say the child is, in quotes, saved. Let's say we figure out a way that this child is now safe, is nurtured, everything is going along great. Clinically, the child is responding to treatment. Things are looking up and up, okay? Now puberty hits. That child now has to take all the information they've gained around sexual abuse and apply it to themselves again to the process of puberty. and awaking sexually. So you can see how they have to relive that every time, every developmental milestone. Fast forward, now they're having children of their own, and they have to relive that again. How do I protect my children? What does this make me, how do I respond to this? What do I need to do? Every developmental milestone requires going back and addressing that traumatic event. That can be extremely, extremely taxing on any energy a person has. Depression is right at the door. When these things happen, depression is right there. And an awareness of those things as a clinician, going, okay, depression is going to be lurking around this person. It's going to be very difficult for this person to recover. Now I want to talk about the other thing that, as a society, we don't really focus on: chronic low-level stress. And I'm not talking about the stress, but it can be included in here. I'm not talking about the stress of being at work and going, did I get this report done? Did I complete all these things? I'm not talking about just that stress. When you watch a scary movie on TV, it causes a stress response in you. Again, tons of research that show this. When you watch the exciting show, it causes stress. We do this all the time. We've been doing this for decades. We turn on TV as, in quotes, entertainment. So this chronic low-level stress, that's always there. It's always in the background. People say, well, I just want to watch TV. Okay, they're watching TV, scary show, whatever it is that they watch. Being exposed to those traumas, what's a show? Basically any cop show. There's always somebody getting murdered at the beginning of those shows. That kind of kicks off the whole thing. And then each show has a different way of depicting the crime scene, that kind of thing. You're being exposed to this stuff, and we as a society, we don't even recognize that as a stressor. Does that mean I would encourage people to not watch TV? Absolutely. Stop watching it. So, social, non-physical, environmental. In all of these situations that I described, the stressors, one of the commonalities is isolation. And that plays throughout. And how it isolates us. We always feel alone. When Lori was dying, I didn't even know how to ask for help. I didn't even know how to engage people. It was so, especially the year or two before she died, I didn't know how to reach out. If you were to walk up to me and say, hey, what do you need me to do for you today? I wouldn't have an answer to you because I didn't know. I didn't know what I needed. So I was very isolated. A lot of it was self-inflicted too, because it required so much energy to talk to people. It just drained me. Like going to church should be something that would be filling, and it wasn't. It was terrifying to me. And even to this day, it's really hard. I can walk into other churches, and I do just fine. But going to Eau Claire, I'm a mess. And it's still to this day. So we're talking, again, 10 years after the fact. I thought about going back there the other day. I wanted to meet with, your dad, and just chat with him about some stuff. And I got emotional. I was like, okay, well, we're going to meet at Culver's. And that's a whole other issue. Yes, it does relate to the food thing. But yeah, that's because I can't do that. It's so emotionally taxing even now. So, social media causes isolation. It is designed to mimic addiction. Okay, so if you like social media, and I don't have a social media presence, I hate the stuff. And yeah, I'm a tech guy. I don't like it at all, and I encourage anybody to stop or minimize your exposure to social media. My children love social media, and we have conversations about it all the time. But it is designed to mimic addiction. It is specifically made that way. Mark Zuckerberg hired, I think it was between 50 and 100 therapists to design Facebook with that scrolling feature in the middle. You ever think, it's so common now, everybody you scroll. It's designed that way because it's like, oh, what's that next? Oh, you see a name, you see a picture of somebody you know. Oh, what are they doing? Oh, what are they doing? And you just keep on scrolling. It is designed to grab you and hold you. And you look at TikTok, you look at Instagram, WhatsApp, you look at any of those, and they are designed to grab you and hold you. And here's the problem with that. Every second you're facing that screen, you're not talking to another human being. It takes you out of the mix. FOMO, fear of missing out, anxiety. Again, designed to do this. Now I'm going to backhandedly brag about my youngest, because she is, and if she ever sees this, she'll yell at me. She's seen me give this presentation before, and she's yelled at me, so it's nothing new. Okay, so my youngest daughter, Emily, she is an engineer, crazy smart girl. She works for Lockheed Martin and makes too much money for a person that age, because she is not responsible. Okay, I said my dad thing. Anyways, no, she's actually very responsible. She's a homeowner, all the good things. I remember seeing this thing, she sent me snapshots in text, because I don't have social media. I think they put Instagram on my phone, but I don't know how to use it. She sent me these texts, and in there, she shows 4 different mountain ranges in Denver, because that's where she lives. And she's on these 4 different mountains. And it's a big thing, apparently, to climb 14s, do like 3 or 4 in a single day. That's like a big thing out there in Denver. So she shows this, right? And she has all these pictures standing on the mountain, chin in the air, doing one of these, it's the usual noise that you see on social media. Then the next day, she shows me she's at a formal, it's a formal gown event. People are in tuxedos. It was put on by Lockheed Martin. There are astronauts walking around in the room, and she's got pictures with these people, right? So that's the next day. So on Friday, she did the mountains. On Saturday, she had this formal event. Sunday, and this is not going to be well received here, she went to church at Red Rock. I don't know if you're familiar with Red Rock, but it's a giant amphitheater in the mountains. And they have like Michael W. Smith playing there and Christian music and all this stuff. And so she had that in there. And then on Monday, she did something else really, really crazy amazing. And I said, Emily, what are you doing? And please don't put this on social media. And she goes, well, Dad, I'm literally just sending you share links from my social media page. I said, this is that whole FOMO thing. And she goes, yeah, I have that too. I'm always worried about whatever somebody else is doing, that I'm going to miss out on their stuff. Are you kidding? I can't comprehend it, because her life is very full. She does so many things, but she also describes FOMO, fear of missing out. What are those other people doing that I'm not doing? My son, Nick, he bites on it occasionally, but the 2 girls, they bite the hardest on it. They will do that kind of stuff. The other one lives in Florida and does pretty much the same thing. And yes, I do this. I'm a dad, so I get to do this. I wag my finger at them. But they're older now, and they do what they will. Okay, social media is designed to give you a false sense of self, and in the negative. Now, what it does is it creates a situation where you're looking at it, and you go, just like I was saying about my daughter, oh, what are they doing that I'm not? Oh, they have a cool thing. I don't. So you begin to look at what other people have. And you don't look at the blessings God has given you, because you're always looking at what do the Joneses have, keeping up with the Joneses, only it's on an epic scale. It's designed to make you spend more time on it, and we go back to that mimicking addiction thing. So at the end of the day, what does the Bible say? When Lori and I met, I was searching for a religion. I was born and brought up into the Wisconsin Synod. I was kind of I think my confirmation class was like 60 or 70 kids. There were 3 teachers, so it was not, I didn't understand what I was doing. I knew taking communion with the lack of understanding I had was a bad idea, right? So I didn't until I met Lori, and I became part of the CLC, because somebody actually sat me down and talked to me about what was going on in communion. And actually, oh, that makes sense. I get this. What really kind of rang my bell, now I'm studying to be a clinician at this time, was forgiveness. That idea of forgiveness. And I didn't understand before, and it was very interesting. My understanding of forgiveness kind of dovetailed with my clinical training, and what I learned was that forgiveness is so powerful. It is so amazingly powerful that if you can forgive, and not just others, but yourself, accept that forgiveness. And that's, by the way, I'm still struggling with that. That's why I still fall apart when I talk about failing Lori. I still struggle with that. That's a hard one. And I think I will probably, I hope not, I will probably struggle with that for the rest of my life, is being able to accept that forgiveness, that the Lord does forgive. And I accept that, but it's so hard for me to forgive myself. That right there, if you get nothing out of this whole thing, that is the key. That's what this whole thing is all about. If you can go back and in your pain, start working on forgiveness of others, and your forgiveness of self, and letting go of that pain. Because that's what forgiveness is you're letting go. You're letting go of that hurt. I think the Greek, and the pastor would have to correct me, I think the Greek is roughly translated into to neglect. And I don't know if, I don't ask me the Greek word, but I remember something about that is to let go or to neglect. And it's talking about feelings of hurt and pain. Let's see. Now, what do I have here? Okay, solutions. Real quick, pray. I can't stress it enough. Frequently, and while I was up here, believe it or not, one of my prayers was, please God, please God, please God, please God, because that's like my mantra, to make sure that I don't mess up. And if I do mess up, it actually helps somebody in messing up. But pray. Mission critical. Absolutely mission critical. Forgive others. And internalizing, accepting that forgiveness. Attend some type of social gathering. This counts. This does count. You don't always have to socialize. And church is a great place. But some type of social gathering where you bump into people a little bit. You know, if depression has really got you, don't do a ton. You know, it's not like, hey, let's go out dancing. But it's some type of, something that gets you around other people. Find a way to give back. What research is showing is that folks who are struggling with depression and anxiety, they tend to do better in therapy when they volunteer someplace, when they're working even an hour or two a week, or an hour a week. Just give something back to people. It does help a lot. And trust me, I know, I've found that to be the case for myself. Stop all social media. Just, if you can't stop cold turkey, start with 5 minutes a day, or just start by not looking at your phone the first thing when you wake up, even though that's your alarm clock. Go buy a different alarm clock if you can. But stay away from social media. It is designed to make you depressed. It is designed to cater to depression and anxiety. Sleep schedules. You gotta keep a regular sleep schedule. And my son, Nick, his job used to require him to bounce all over the United States. And I would call him and say, where are you? And he would say, just a minute. And he'd have to look at the map on his phone and then tell me, oh, I'm in Washington State. Oh, I am in New York, or I'm in Arizona. Because he would just get on a plane at night. He wouldn't know. He'd land at wherever he was supposed to go. He'd get there. He'd literally forget because he wasn't sleeping. And now he's got a new job, thank the Lord, and he's working from home, and so he has a more normal sleep schedule. He's now, I think, his third month into this, and we were just talking the other day, and he's like, yeah, it does actually make a difference. He says, I do feel better. He says, I feel like I can do more things. I feel more aware. And then eat healthy, and there's so much research around eating healthy. Basically, the rule of thumb, if it's, cheap, easy, cheap, easy, or there's another one I had in there, don't eat it. Because it's probably not good for you. Eat healthy as much as you can. The guy who made the Hippocratic Oath originally back in Greek times, Hippocrates, I don't know, whatever his name was. He's famous for saying, let your food be your medicine and let your medicine be your food. And that is huge. And I'm learning that the older I get. I'm learning that. So I would encourage you all to kind of keep that in mind. But pray forgiveness, socialize somehow, even though it's going to be really hard. Get out of social media if you can. Hopefully your job doesn't involve something like that, and eat healthy. So that's it in a nutshell. I went over time, so sorry, Pastor. And then I guess we're going to take questions at the end, right? Okay. Yep.
All right, I think we'll get started again, part 2. All right, so when Dean and I were first given this assignment to do this seminar, we did meet together and talk about kind of a framework. And I think that my section kind of builds off of his to get into the area of relationships a little bit more specifically. Dean's was an overall look at depression and anxiety and a lot of the symptoms associated with that. And he talked a lot about relationships as a key there. And what I want to do in my part 2 is dig into that, especially in light of God's Word, and see the power of relationships when it comes to depression and anxiety. I'm going to start with a little bit of my background in this topic. When I've heard the topic of depression discussed, in my experience, when I've looked into it, I've talked to other people about it, so often people focus on why. It's kind of one of those areas of our lives, and especially when we think of our faith, where we want to ask that question of God, why? Why is this happening to me? What can I do about this? What is the cause? And as I get started here, and I think about depression, I always want to offer a word of caution about cause. Ultimately, if we're suffering from something, we want to know why. And you kind of have to get to why. You have to get to the cause, ultimately, if you want healing from that. But my point is, if we focus solely on that, or so much, we can avoid the pathway to getting to that. It's hard to determine cause, like Dean said, with these things like depression, anxiety. They're not always there in the same way every day. There's different types of symptoms. Depression and anxiety have a way of hijacking the reasoning capability for us to detect the cause. So if we're so focused on the cause and we're so focused on why, we can get led astray pretty quickly. I want to share 2 different views of looking at that. We might call this the difference between the lifestyle model of depression and the medical model of depression. The quote on the left, depression is not inevitable, something that simply happens and cannot be avoided, nor is it ever so far gone that the depression cannot be counteracted. The cycle can always be reversed at any point by biblical action in the power of the Holy Spirit. The hope for the depressed person, as elsewhere, lies in this: the depression is the result of the counselee's sin. That's the lifestyle model. That's the model that says the cause of depression is always something that you're doing. And if you're a Christian, it's something that you're doing wrong. Imagine somebody carrying the burden of depression, and that's the hope that you offer them. You're going to just tear them down even further. But this is a Christian who's advocating this position that there's nothing medical about depression. There's nothing physical in your body going on. It's all your lifestyle, the choices that you're making. The responsibility is all yours. This quote actually, sadly, came from the Christian counseling manual that I was given in seminary. That's where I took that quote. So it's more widespread than you might think in Christian circles. Here's the other side of it, the medical model. Depression is a whole body illness. It involves the body, mood, and thoughts. Depression affects the way you eat and sleep. It can also affect the way you feel about yourself and things. It is not the same as being unhappy or in a blue mood. It is not a sign of personal weakness or a condition that can be willed or wished away. When you have depression, you can't pull yourself together and get better. Treatment is often needed and many times crucial to recovery. So the key word here in the medical model is the idea of illness. I think this is the prevalent view of depression in our culture today, that it's almost given this status of something beyond your control, something that you contribute nothing to, something to which you have no responsibility. Everything mentioned here is true about depression, but there are things that we do in life too that can contribute to that. Like Dean said, the way that we eat, our habits and our structure of our day, whether or not we use social media. Those are choices that we're making. That's not just sort of this illness that you're helpless to. So I think the warning there from the medical model is giving depression the implication that there's nothing you can do about it. It's just something that happens. The truth of cause is often somewhere in the middle between these two areas. We use the overall phrases nature versus nurture, and that applies here too. And so there are things from both sides that are true about depression. This element may not include any spiritual element to depression, but we know that's not the case as Christians. We know there's a spiritual side to it. But the warning is, be careful about making cause your primary pursuit. If you just look at what depression is, what you know about it, what you see it doing in your life, and you start from that standpoint and address those things, look at what it is rather than asking the question why, you will get to the cause. But if you focus too much on either side, you're going to miss the truth somewhere in the middle. I think there's biblical wisdom in this too. John 9, as Jesus was passing by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that God's works might be revealed in connection with him." Jesus wasn't talking about depression or anxiety here, but he gives a warning about trying to focus too much on cause. The disciples were convinced that this man had done something wrong to deserve this affliction. And Jesus' point to them is, why this happened from your perspective doesn't really matter. What matters is what God is going to do through this. The glory of God is going to be revealed through this man. So there's biblical wisdom in that too. We don't have knowledge about everything. Our perspective in life is limited on every topic. So if we make everything about understanding 100% the cause of why something's happening, it probably means we're hanging on to control in our lives a bit too much. And we're not going to find solutions that way. Here's what I see as a balanced Christian perspective on depression. This comes from a book called I Trust When Dark My Road. It was written by a pastor named Todd Peppercorn, and it's basically his personal story of his struggle with depression. Here's how he describes depression. For the Christian, depression hits them at the very core of being. Can God really be doing this to me? Does he care at all? Why does he hate me so much? Am I worse than all the other sinners somehow that I deserve this? Because depression is an extreme turning inward upon the self, it is fertile ground for Satan to plant his chaff of doubt and despair. He uses the fact that you have no energy, that you are trapped in the labyrinth of your own mind, to draw you away from the very things you need the most as a suffering sinner. A lot of this is in the pursuit of why. And if you read that book by Peppercorn, he talks about he approached his depression immediately from a Lutheran Christian perspective. He applied what he had been taught as a Christian with his depression, and it spiraled his life out of control. And we're going to get to another quote where basically he explains what happened in his life when he hit rock bottom. But this last part is really what we want to focus on. Satan wants to draw our attention away from the things that God has given us to help us in our suffering. And there's biblical things that God has given us. there's things for our faith, but there's also things in the world around us, things that are part of God's design that can help us. But if, again, our focus is why? Why is this happening? What's the cause? I'm losing control. If that's our immediate focus that we jump to, then we're going to keep spiraling downward. Peppercorn says when he got to this last thought, he realized the thing that Satan was pushing him away from was the relationships in his life. Just like Dean was talking about in his presentation. In my presentation, that's really what we're going to end up focusing on. He talked about how, because of his depression, he purposely isolated himself. He didn't know how to handle it. He didn't know how he was going to come across to other people. He couldn't handle the responsibilities of his ministry. He felt crushed under the weight. He said just to do an hour's worth of study on his sermon took him days to try to muster up the energy to do that. And so he pushed himself away from people. And he realized he was pushing himself away from the very thing that God had given him to give him healing. So if we step back a bit from cause and asking that question, why? Well, what is depression from just the angle of what is it that we see happening? Let's just let's take that step first. Dean talked about a lot of the symptoms that we see in real time. Here's one of the models that's used to talk about what is depression, what is happening. This is called the stress diathesis model. And basically what that means is it's trying to explain how depression works in real time from the perspective of a model. And basically you have these four things happening that are playing off of each other in real time. There's a biological component to depression, things that are happening inside your body. There's a genetic precursors to that. There are things that are occurring in your environment around you, some things that you're doing, some things that are being done that you can't control. There are things that are triggers for each individual that are different. We look at those as maybe sparks that can ignite and inflame depressive symptoms. And then the phenotype is when we start to experience the symptoms and we start to feel them and they manifest themselves in our lives. So these things are all, we know they're all playing off of each other, but sometimes the sequence isn't always the same. Sometimes the starting stage isn't always the same one for each individual. So if I'm suffering from depression, perhaps it's things in my environment that are starting that process off, but it might be different for someone else. And if I go and tell somebody, well, it's got to be this because that's what it was for me, that's not going to help them. Here are some of the other things from an environmental standpoint and a trigger standpoint in the boxes there that play in as well in those areas. So look at this maybe as a model to help us see what is happening rather than why is it happening. And as soon as we see what is happening, you can start to work on it. You can start to treat it. Some of the more recent statistics, just to give you a perspective of this topic in our culture today. We talk a lot about the statistics, but here are some of the more recent ones. We're talking about both depression and anxiety today. Anxiety is the most prevalent mental health disorder that people experience. 40 million adults in the United States have experienced or are currently experiencing symptoms of anxiety, 19% of the population. Depression is often talked about maybe more or just as often as anxiety, but it's actually less common, but still quite prevalent. When you take depression and anxiety together, a study from 2015 found that 45% of individuals, this is with depressive disorder, had one or more also anxiety disorders that went along with that. So that's when the two symptoms combine on top of each other where a person is suffering from both. Almost half of people with a major depressive disorder also have at least one or two anxiety disorders as well. From the CDC, from August 2020 to February 2021, the percentage of adults with a diagnosed anxiety or depressive disorder went from 36.4% to 41.5%, and the largest increases in a much younger category. But what happened during those years? The pandemic. And I think what Dean said about technology use and social media went hand in hand with the social isolation of that time period. and especially in what demographic? A younger demographic. And so when we see those rates, we realize we can't always immediately answer why, but we want to start understanding what is causing these rates to keep going up. When you look at our world today, we live in a society that is more affluent, that has better access to medical health care, that lives longer outside of pre-flood times than any other generation in the history of the world, and yet these mental health disorders are going higher and higher and higher. Clearly, there's something going on that we as a society are not talking about enough. We talked about some of the symptoms of depression. What about anxiety? How is anxiety different? On the left-hand side, this might be a little hard to see, but the left-hand side are physical symptoms associated with depression and anxiety. Depression would be on this side, anxiety on this side. Here are some of the shared. And then here would be the mental symptoms, what's shared between the two. So sometimes it's hard to differentiate between depression and anxiety. Often they're just lumped into the same category, but in reality, they're actually quite different, and it's important that we understand how they are different. At the end of the day, both depression and anxiety kind of disassemble, if you will, our ability to emotionally cope and understand with what we're going through. They kind of hijack those systems in our lives. That's kind of the feeling of the cloudiness mentally, or not really knowing what's going on in life. Like Dean said, his experience was the meh idea, that feeling of that's just was the knee-jerk response to things. It just sort of disassembles those functions in our bodies and in our minds. But the way they actually work independently is quite different. One way that I like to explain this to people is with an electrical circuit. With depression, what you kind of have going on is that the electrical circuit has been cut. It's broken. A lot of times depressed individuals, they just kind of want to feel something in life. They just have this gray feeling all the time. It's almost like everything's just sort of in a fog, and they can't even describe what it's like. It's like the electrical circuit has just been shut off. Anxiety is a little bit different. Anxiety would be more like there's a tremendous surge through the electrical line and it trips the breaker. At the end of the day, you get to the same place as depression, the circuit is damaged. It's not functioning, but for different reasons. People that are suffering from an anxiety disorder often have an extreme sense of emotion or feeling. A lot of irrational beliefs come along with that. Feeling flooded is the term that is used in the mental health community, that they're just overwhelmed by it. A depressed individual has a different feeling or perspective on that. But at the end of the day, the result is pretty much the same. You see a lot of shared commonality between the two. One of the resources that I have that I've used before, it's called A Guide to Interpersonal Psychology. And interpersonal just means person to person. So that resource focuses on the factor of relationships, exactly what we're talking about in these presentations. And in this book, it talks about, when does depression happen? What are the things going on in life that can trigger depression or that are associated with depression? And here's a list of the most common ones that are given in this book. Again, this doesn't include everything, but from the research done in this book, from that perspective, these are the most common. Across all of these, one of the shared common features of all of these scenarios is it involves relationships. It involves relationships. So the book calls it's the context of a social or interpersonal event in our lives. And so when we look at the research and we say, we may not understand why all these things are happening necessarily, but if we just look at what's happening and when it's happening, it's almost always with depression and anxiety in the context of a social or interpersonal event in our lives. This helps us understand how to go about treating it as well. The power of relationships. Back to Pastor Todd Peppercorn in his book, he writes there, "The day ended and I came home alive. It was not my efforts, but the people God had put in my path who kept me here. On my own, I would surely have been lost, but I was not lost because I was never alone, even though the demons in my mind were telling me I was. This is the low point that he talks about. He had tried so many different things to try to cope with his depression, to try to treat his depression, and it only made it worse. And at this point in his life, he could barely fulfill his responsibilities at home or at work. And this day that he's talking about was Good Friday. He says on Good Friday one year, he had made the decision to kill himself. He thought that was his only way out. And notice what he says was the turning point for him. The people God had put in my path kept me here. He talks about that day on Good Friday. He had resolved to do that, and out of the blue, one of his friends called him up, and they went out for an hour to have coffee. And he said that was the moment that changed his mind that day, and that gave him the opportunity to start working back. It didn't solve everything that one day, but it's paused that pathway that he was on. It was the stop sign, and it gave him the opportunity to start healing in the right direction. And for the first time, he realized, I need to stop pushing people out and isolating myself, and I need to use the people that God has given me. If you want to look at the blessings that God gives our lives, there's many spiritual blessings in the Bible, obviously, but just the people in our lives are some of the greatest blessings that God uses for healing. And when we look at the data, when we look at the studies, when we look at why people suffer from depression and anxiety, we see relationships at the core of it all. The power of relationships. Like Dean talked about, disconnection. That's the opposite of building that social element of our lives. And some of you may be thinking, well, I'm an introvert. I don't have that in my. That's not who I am. I'm an introvert too. I know what it feels like to be an introvert. And it's important to realize, and I was always told, an introvert doesn't need people and an extrovert needs people. And so, if you're an introvert, you think, well, why are relationships important to me if I don't really need them? How do I fit into this? Well, in reality, the difference between an introvert and an extrovert is an introvert, it's draining mentally for them to be in social situations. It's tiring. It exhausts them a little bit. Whereas an extrovert, it kind of gives them energy. They thrive off of it. They look for it. Notice the key is both need relationships. Even if you're introverted, you need relationships. It's usually just in a different context than a social gathering that's in the public. But you still need people. You need that connection with individuals. Disconnection pushes us away from all of those things. There's the social media aspect. I agree with Dean. I think that's a huge problem with why we're seeing the rates go up. But busyness, that aspect of our lives, we may not be connected to social media, but if we make our lives busy, if we feel like we have to do that, that can be very overwhelming too. Going to things to find numbing or to find distraction rather than to actually process things. In the mental health community, we talk about that word processing a lot with your emotions, with your past experiences, and that's a very key word. And what processing means is you kind of work it into your life and you understand it, kind of like your short-term versus long-term memory. If everything in your life stayed on your short-term memory, man, you'd be overwhelmed right away at the beginning of the day. God has given us a short-term memory that, okay, something's on my mind now, and then bam, I wipe it off, I move on, and I go on to the next thing. Processing's a bit like that. If we keep everything emotionally inside of us and never work it into our lives and understand it, we're going to be overwhelmed. And we're going to look for sources to numb that overwhelming feeling. And that's where technology, pornography, substance abuse often go hand in hand with depression and anxiety because people turn to those things as a distraction. But ultimately, it's also a disconnection from social relationships. Some of the Bible passages that go into this, Isaiah 55, why do you spend your money for what is not bread, your wages for what does not satisfy? That's a key word in our faith, is finding satisfaction. Finding satisfaction is a lot more important than finding pleasure or being distracted for a moment. The Lord talks about over and over in his word the pathway to satisfaction, to fulfillment. And that goes hand in hand with how he's created us. God has created us in certain ways to find true satisfaction for the things that we're struggling with. And relationships are a very important part of that. One of the things that we do in the mental health field is we look at systems. Systems basically means a way of understanding humanity. And there's different types of systems in mental health, which means that if you seek out counseling, you might not always get the same advice or the same structure from a counselor because they have a different system or worldview in which they see humanity. And if your worldview is different from a biblical worldview on what humanity is, well, then your solutions are going to be different too. And Dean brought this up in his presentation of what is the element of humanity that we see in God's design for us. What is a biblical personality theory? You're not going to find this in the secular counseling world. They're not going to account for certain elements of who we are when it comes to the therapy that they offer. So just a summary of what does it mean to be a human from a biblical standpoint? Created in God's image, and there's different elements that are about that image of God. We're both soul and body. That's a pretty big element to a biblical worldview. We're not just lumps of flesh. We're not just machines. But there's a spiritual soul aspect to our lives. People who are materialists in a strict sense of the word, I think they know that about life. They know that we're more than just flesh and blood, but their theories and their solutions don't often incorporate the spiritual side of life. We're under God's authority. So that means two things for us. It's important to listen to what God says about the problems we're experiencing, but also the solutions. But also, God is there above the fray. God is above the problems that we encounter. He's able to help us in a way that no other person can help us in the world. Number 4 is obviously an element of who we are. We're fallen because of sin. We have to understand that about ourselves as we seek to understand the things we're going through. And then number 5, we're justified. I would put this right in the same category as what Dean talked about with forgiveness. That is such a crucial element to mental and spiritual health. Another way of looking at this is a biblical relationship hierarchy. C.S. Lewis wrote in his book, The Four Loves, he said, "Friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy, like art. It has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things which gives value to survival." So I think he hits the nail on the head of the world's going to look at relationships and kind of, yeah, we have relationships, but they're not that important. They don't really add anything to life. There's no practical or pragmatic value to them. And I think Lewis describes it well, that relationships give meaning to everything else in life. You may see them as unnecessary. You may think that you can just plow ahead in life without them and be fine, but they give quality because they're part of God's design for us. In a hierarchy, we see ourselves at the top. When you look at a person's life, you're probably only going to see the tip of the pyramid. I don't put myself at the top because that's the most important part. It's the smallest piece of the pyramid, for one thing. But it's also when you look at somebody, that's what you're going to see. You're not going to see everything else that's underneath that. It takes time to dig into that. But our lives, we don't exist independent of everything else around us, especially the relationships God has put in there. Our lives are built on the relationships that God has provided for us. Here's the thing. If you have a crack in these areas, it's going to affect the top of the pyramid, isn't it? And that's where we see in mental health, we're seeing the data that shows depression, anxiety, other things that go along with that. A lot of them are related to trauma in relationships, to dysfunctional relationships, not working the way that they're intended to, relationship struggles and discord, whatever it may be, as these foundational elements are depleted, everything else will topple down on top of that too. So I think there's hope in a model like this to realize my life is a lot more than just myself. And when I'm talking to somebody, their life's about a lot more than just what I see. There's a lot underneath all that. But the power of relationships too. We know there is no other foundation that anyone can lay than that which has been laid, which is Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 11. How important it can be for our mental health to have a foundation of relationships that are strong and healthy. And here's the hope that we have from God. If some of these things in your life aren't working very well or are cracked or have issues, it's okay. God can heal that too. You're not broken forever. And that's part of the reason of seeing it that way as well. Just to look at some of the relationship examples in the Bible as well. If you look in your Bible and you center in on the topic of relationships, you'll see the power of that coming in all over the place. And again, we're talking beyond just depression and anxiety here, but we're seeing God's design of how our lives should look, what he wants our lives to look like. Jonathan and David, the friendship that they had, the book of Proverbs offering wisdom, 1 Corinthians talking about the church as the body of Christ. It's a relationship. The word fellowship is obviously a relational term. Abraham being called God's friend. What a wonderful thought. That Abraham had that distinction by faith. You and I have that too, that we are friends of God. What a powerful thought that is when it comes to relationship. So many more could be listed, but just a little smattering of some of the examples in Scripture. Perhaps the strongest one here expressed in John 15, greater love has no one than this than to lay down his life for his friends. Jesus talking there about himself and what he was going to do for the disciples. But notice he says, I no longer call you servants, but I've called you friends. What a wonderful thought paired with the love of our Savior. You see how God's word is not just speaking to church things, but it's speaking to real life things too, like depression and anxiety. And so much of what we see about these secular topics in our world today go back to the people in our lives, the relationships that we have, good and bad. And to be able to add in the element of a relationship with Christ by faith, how powerful that can be for our well-being. I think you look at God's relationship design, relationships are uniquely designed to bring clarity to confusion, to bring connection to loneliness, to bring healing to pain, to bring protection to weakness, to bring wholeness to struggle, to bring forgiveness to wrongdoing. I think you look at that list, like me, you could probably look at each of those bullet points and think of somebody in your life that has done that for you. Maybe thinking of times you've done that for someone else. That's the power of connection. But as our lives get more disconnected, as we do more things in isolation or just over media, as we lose the art of being around other people and having community with other people, as our relationships fall by the wayside because of the busyness in our lives, we also lose what God has designed relationships to be and to do in our lives. This is important for us to regain as Christians. One last thought on the element of relationships, looking again at data that we see. One of the more recent mental health studies that has taken place is what's called the ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So this was a study that was conducted in the 90s, and it had 17,000 participants. I don't know of another study that's been that large, on that large of a scale. But basically, it looked at 17,000 participants, and it asked them if they had these types of things occur in their childhood before they were 18 years old. And that's what we call these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, and there's 10 of them. In the category of abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. In the category of neglect, physical or emotional, and then household dysfunction, mental illness, incarcerated relative, mother treated them violently, substance abuse, or divorce. So there's just 10 of these adverse childhood experiences. And what this study showed is that the more ACEs an individual has, the higher likelihood they are to suffer not just mentally, but there was also physical symptoms that came along in this study. Here's another slide that talks about that. How prevalent are these adverse childhood studies? The most prevalent one was physical abuse. 28.3% of those in the study had suffered physical abuse. Another very high one, household substance abuse. Divorce is obviously very high up there as well. Of the 17,000 participants, 64% of them had at least one adverse childhood experience. Don't you see from the data, this is not a religious study, but don't you see the impact of relationships in our lives, good and bad? They're protective, but the flip side of that coin is they can also be damaging because they're designed by God in that way. Here's kind of a breakdown of that study. In the first column, individuals who had no adverse childhood experiences. The percentages of becoming an alcoholic, suffering from depression, having problems working, serious financial problems, chance of heart disease, and having a stroke. One of the thresholds in this study is a score of 4 or higher. That's column number 2. 4 or higher, look at how these figures jump. Look at depression, 15% to 42% in women, 10% to 30% in men. And then 4 or higher, increased risk. There can be up to a 4-fold increase of alcoholism, tripled, doubled. So this is not a complicated study. There's simply 10 factors that they isolated, but it's one of the most fundamental studies that are used today in therapy because there's so much backing to it. 17,000 participants, but even since the 90s, there's been more studies that have indicated the very same thing. Makes you think of God provides homes for those who are deserted. That's what God wants in our lives. He is the creator. He has given us relationships. Like Dean said, it is not good that man should be alone. All the way back at the very beginning of the Bible, today, we see the very same evidence for our lives. Now, I'm not pointing this out again to say these things are the only cause of depression and anxiety. Again, I'm not worried that much about cause. We can get there as we develop our understanding. But I'm just looking at what do we see happening right now in anxiety and depression. And without a doubt, we can say relationships are at the top of the list of what we see occurring when it comes to the positive and negative outcomes. One last illustration that I want to share. From a Christian perspective, this is another example that I use to try to explain what is our approach to this. Are we building towers or castles? The way I look at a lot of the treatments for depression and anxiety from a therapy standpoint, I look at them as like towers. Medication, talk therapy, exercises, those types of things, a lot of the things that were on Dean's list. They're like towers. They're temporary places of refuge. Like for Todd Peppercorn, he found on Good Friday that day, his friend was a tower. It was a place of refuge for him. It was a stopgap to get him started back on the right path. It wasn't total healing. A tower, though, it's not a place where you're going to have community. It's not a place where you're going to have a family. It's not a home. It's not a place to live in permanently. So as Christians, we want to recognize there's value to using what's at our disposal to treat depression and anxiety, whether that be a secular thing or a spiritual thing. We should use what God has given us, and that can include medication, different types of treatment, therapy. There's a time and a place for all of those things. But we want to recognize they're towers. We don't want to live in those things forever and see that as a complete solution. God tells us what the castle is. That's God's design in Scripture. The design for humanity that went astray because of sin that has broken the world, but the design that's also been restored in Christ. Those two words, design and forgiveness, are pretty integral words to mental health. We've really touched on that. What was lost through God's design, what we're living with right now, is restored by Christ's grace through forgiveness. Now, physically, mentally, we're never going to experience that in a full sense from our experience until we get to heaven. But the castle can start being built even here on earth now. God gives us a place where we can live and dwell and move forward in security through what Christ has given us. And that's where we want to see beyond just the towers, the temporary stops, and we want to get to what will really heal our lives too. And sometimes that takes long for people. That takes a lifetime. But God gives us things that can help. And as Christians, we're right on the forefront of being able to utilize both, being able to bridge that gap between the world around us and the church, and seeing the value from both perspectives. One last parting thought. Isaiah 61, verse 11, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the afflicted. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release for those who are bound." Isaiah wrote these words. Jesus fulfilled these words. And what a wonderful thought as we think about a titled Battles of Brokenness with depression and anxiety. The Lord sent Jesus to bind up the brokenhearted. This is the power that we have. This is the pathway to healing, is finding what Christ has done for us, bringing that into our focus, sharing that with others, using that in our lives, in addition to everything else God has given us. So hopefully our discussion today helps you understand depression and anxiety a little bit better, helps you give some thought to some things that can help. But, at least from my standpoint, if there was one thing I would really hone in on, it's relationships. The people in your life, but even more so, your relationship with God by faith. That is, to me, the most powerful factor in these topics. Okay, that concludes our presentations. We've got a 5 to 10 minute break here, and then we'll take any questions. If you want to put your questions in the box, you can do that. If you want to just ask them from the floor, you can do that too. So we'll take wrap up our seminar in 5 to 10 minutes with our Q&A session.
It's slightly different. So remember when I was talking about, my depression, if I got cornered and I had to deal with people that I didn't want to deal with, or I felt they were messing with me somehow, I came off like that 13-year-old mouthy kid. That my mind would just go there, and I'd have all these little mouthy comebacks, which even not in a depressed state, and this is, part of my foibles as a human being, I tend toward that anyways. I want to be that mouthy, smart alecky kid. And again, it's something that I need to struggle with, and that's my struggle. So, but cynicism is an interesting piece of that, because if depression is there, it's going to be really hard to find anything good, in anything that's offered. No hope, exactly. That sense of, why bother? And that's where, that why bother. Here was the interesting thing for me in my depression. I never argued with God, right? Like some people are like, why God? Why did you do this to me? That didn't occur to me. That wasn't part of my struggle. So I never had to ask the question, why bother? I just figured God had something in mind. I didn't know what it was. I thought about Job sometimes and like, wow, that would not be good to be him. That's kind of where my mind went. That's kind of the best I could come up with. But I figured God had a plan. I didn't know what it was. I didn't like not knowing. Oh, I hated that because I'm a little bit of a control freak that way. I kind of want to know the next thing. Um, so that's where it kicked me is that I didn't have that peace. But when you start, questioning God and saying, "Why are you doing this to me?" You can see that, where that peace, why bother? What's the deal here? Why should I care? Um, and a lot of people, depression, especially, again, and I know I sound like I'm just harping on social media, but with social media, everything's about clicking, getting you to click the next thing, and so when, like, I have a little farmette in the middle of nowhere, so I'm constantly on YouTube trying to figure out how to fix whatever it is that I'm trying to fix. So many rabbit holes, so many rabbit holes, and click on, what's this? It's only 3 minutes. I'm going to watch this. But what I find is that there's always kind of this undercurrent of kind of why bother. The end is nigh. There's always kind of, and maybe it's the feed that I have. I look at my wife's feed, and she's got like flowers and all sorts of cool stuff, and mine has how to fix things and why bother. It has that kind of motif to it, and so maybe there's something there. But long and short of it is, I think if depression has got a hold of you, and you see that cynicism, I would encourage you to just kind of lay that on the Lord and just say, okay, I have no clue what you're up to. I don't get this. I don't understand this. And this is what I did for me. And so I guess I'm prescribing for you what I did, as I don't get this, but okay, I'm just going to suffer through this. I don't like this. And I would really like not to do this. But for me, it lasted years. Here, and I don't know if this is going to be the same for everybody. The guy Peppercorn. I'm sorry, Peppercorn. He talked about wanting to kill himself on Good Friday, right? And there was this friend that kind of he bumped into and said, "Hey, let's go for coffee." That was his moment of clarity or lucidity. My moment was on a highway in the middle of the desert, literally. I was in Pueblo, Colorado, in the desert, driving, just struggling with depression, just like, oh, Lord, please make this stop. Just make it stop. And got into my mantra, please, Lord, please, Lord, please, Lord, please, Lord. And there was a moment that it didn't change. My depression was still there. It's not like, it wasn't the epiphany. There was no angels. There was no ray of light, nothing like that. But somehow it felt different. It felt like, okay, there's something here. And that was, wow, probably 8 years ago, 9 years ago that happened. But it didn't, I still struggle. I mean, you can see me in this presentation. I still fall apart, it's still there. But I would just encourage that. Cynicism will get in there, and if that's kind of your natural lean, it's like, I'm going to question everything, which is good. If that's your natural lean toward things, it's really, depression will grab a hold of that and amplify it. So that's.
I think it's a good question, and it's kind of a unique question because it's from the perspective of not necessarily what do I do when I feel like this, but how do I help someone who feels like that? And just the thought that comes to my mind right off the bat is, like I tried to explain with introvert versus extrovert, there are different ways you can have relationships. It doesn't have to always be this setting where you're in front of it. Like Dean said, it doesn't always have to be church either. Obviously, church has relationship element to it. There's more to it than just having a social relationship. You don't always have to go out to dinner with a group. You don't have to go do something in a very public spotlight area. So I would try to get a sense from that person if the traditional methods of having a relationship are being resisted, what type of human interaction would they like? Because I think that all of us in some way want human interaction. sometimes the behaviors of pushing that interaction away are actually sort of like plain hard to get, if you will, in that sense. Like you outwardly it gets pushed away, but inwardly it's like I really just want more attention. I need somebody to notice my life. So I think everybody needs human interaction to some extent. Like Dean talked about, social media is meant to mimic that. I mean, it's called social media, but it's the paradox is it turns us into antisocial creatures. So it's meant to replace human interaction or make it more convenient, but it actually deters us from it because it reinforces that isolationist mindset. So if you're trying, maybe it's just as simple as saying, hey, what's something that we could do together? What would you like to do? If it's just a one-on-one thing, or maybe you can read that from them without them having to say it. Maybe just try to take notice of what type of interaction does that person need, because it's got to be something. And maybe it takes the form of just digital interaction to begin with, and helping that person see the value of in-person connection too. But what you said at the end there, I think is a big part of it is, it's just, sometimes it just feels like it's one of those things and you just got to keep trying different things. Did you have some thoughts there?
It's interesting that you would ask that question with a child sitting in your lap. Quietly, by the way. Amazing work, by the way. Good job, Mom. Okay. Good job, Mom, first of all. But some of our social interactions are exactly that. Believe it or not, right now, you two are socializing. That's a social interaction. And it's probably one of the most powerful social interactions. The power of touch is amazing. And if you don't believe me, go touch somebody's face, especially a stranger's face, and see how far you get away. That is how powerful touch is. So and it doesn't have to be, touching the person's face. I would discourage you from doing that. But sitting next to them, sitting in the same room quietly, exactly what you're doing right there. That is such a powerful clinical intervention that you're doing right there. We call it being a mom. That's pretty wonderful stuff. Exceptionally powerful. And so socialization doesn't have to be, people in a room. It can literally just be another person in the room. The quietness of just sitting together. It is. I can't understate. There's no way I could, overstate, understate. I get those confused sometimes. Anyways, I can't stress how important it is that connection be there. And again, I can't help but notice, your child in your lap. I mean, it's such a perfect example of that social interaction and that engagement. It's so spot on. Again, doesn't have to be touch. I know, like for me, my social interaction when I was really struggling, I literally bounced across the nation. Some weeks I'd be on both coasts 2-3 times in the same week, just boom, 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 back and forth. But my social interactions were with people at the work site. That's all I could tolerate. So it was very professional, kind of curt. We'd joke around a little bit, there's always that, but it was always about work, but it was contained. But that was that's what I could handle emotionally, so that's all I had. And then I wouldn't see those guys for, maybe months, so I just went back and forth all over the place. And so social interaction, extremely important, but it can be shaped in so many different ways. And I'd encourage you to, if you're the caregiver of this person, I would encourage you to kind of use your imagination that way, even if it's, and I hate saying this, even if it's looking at social media together, you're looking at they looking at theirs and you looking at yours, but you're in the same room, and if you can get away with it, maybe a foot on the person or something like that, not like stomp either, like just touching. I don't know if that's appropriate or not in that relationship or not, or context, but just something. But it's a start, because depression just pulls so much energy out of you, just pulls it out, and it's so hard to kind of put that out there in a relationship that way. So that's another way to do it. So. And for me, and keep in mind, you use the word fixer. You know, you're a fixer. You're talking to two therapists here. This is what we do for a living, or did. I did. And he's doing it. So that's very much part of our lives. That's part of our makeup. You know, whether we know one another intimately or not. I mean, it's kind of, we're wired the same. For me, and Lori is probably the quintessential example. I thought I could cure cancer, but again, it goes back to that ego statement. I am going to fix this. I am going to carry this. And that's what broke me, and that's why I still fall apart when I talk about it. I can't hold myself together because of how much damage it did to me here and here in my heart, you know, thinking that I failed. And there's still a piece of me that's hanging on to that. That's all ego. That's all my ego. That's, for me, that's ego driven. Now, I can't speak, you know, to your situation, but I can say wherever I find that it's my way, I need this, give me, Lord. I'm finding, what I find is eventually I get set up for failure because I am not doing enough. You know, the Lord has made me smart enough for me. He's made me wise enough for me. He's made me strong enough for me, what I need to do, not for all the extra stuff that I am going to, you know, cure cancer. You know, he didn't give me those tools, and there's a reason he didn't. And it's the same reason he doesn't, you know, I don't play the lottery, but if I did win the lottery, I'd be terrible. I'd be a terrible human being. So he doesn't, you know, he's like, no, you should never be rich, you know. And do I say, thank you, Lord? Yeah, but sometimes I'm like, well, maybe a little rich, you know, maybe a little bit, you know, kind of thing. That's what goes in my head, but that's my ego. So the prayer that I pray, and I'm going to let you talk to the professional prayer guy here in a minute. The prayer that I pray is, you know, please, God, this is too heavy. Please carry this for me. So when I find people that are in need of help, it's like, please, Lord, you know, carry this. Carry this for me, carry this for them. So that's my prayer. So now the pro.
Not at all. Well, your question resonated with me, so I'm going to speak from my perspective on it. I'm not saying this is how you feel about it, but I feel that way at times too in my own prayer life. And I find myself having to always remind myself in my prayer life, pay attention to the answer just as much as the request. I think sometimes in our prayer life, we get so focused on the request that unless that's the answer, we forget how valuable the answer can be, especially when it's different than the request. And I think this hits on why this topic is different for Christians, and that's the aspect of guilt. You know, the individual who doesn't have God in his life will still wrestle with depression and anxiety, but it won't attach guilt like it will with the Christian, because it makes us feel like we're not following God like we should. And whether it's in the church or outside the church, almost every Christian that I've counseled on depression eventually reaches the threshold of that question of guilt. And that's usually at the heart of what they're trying to work through. And why I bring that up in prayer life is because I think that when we're asking God for something with the right intention, which you are, which, you know, I doubt that any of us are asking prayers where we deliberately know it's not a good thing or not a God-pleasing thing. So we're going to God with the right intention, going to a God who we know loves us, going to a God who tells us to pray persistently, going to a God who tells us to bring petitions to him time and time again on anything. And then we feel like we keep hitting that brick wall, and the Lord's not answering the prayer. I think the danger there, at least in my experience from my own faith life, is feeling guilty about that. And what does that cause me to do? Pray less. It causes me to detach more from God. Because now I'm worried, well, am I adding guilt to myself through my prayer? Am I doing something wrong that God's displeased with? Is that why God's not answering my prayer like I want him to? Because I'm asking again and again and again. I'm asking for something that's good, and he tells me to come, and I know God's nature. I find that for myself in those scenarios when I feel that guilt, what's happening is I'm focusing too much on the request and I'm not listening to the answer.
Well, I just want the answer I'm asking.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is. So my advice in that scenario would be keep asking. Keep asking. Don't feel bad about asking. God is not going to be mad at you for asking. But also realize if the answer is not what you're asking for, it's going to be better than what you're asking for. And part of the struggle is trying to understand what that is and what shape that answer is going to take in our lives. So for me, when I feel guilty, what usually goes hand in hand with that in my faith is control. There's usually an association. The more that I want control in my faith, the more guilty I feel. Now, again, I'm just speaking from my own perspective. I'm not saying any of you have that association either. But sometimes God's answer to those prayers of mine is, like Dean said, you don't have control. That's my answer. And it's okay. And you're actually better off without it. And then that opens up a whole field of my life and my faith that was completely blocked out because I was so focused on the request and not the answer from God. So, my personal experience. Now, I'm not saying that's your story, but that what you asked resonated with me in that way. I hope that helps.
And that's a great question, and it goes back to that more days than not. Um, stress there's acute stress and chronic stress, and it doesn't necessarily mean the amount of stress, because that's a whole different thing. Like acute stress would be barely getting out of the way of that speeding bus. Acute stress, very high, very short term. Chronic stress, getting out of the way out of that bus every day of your life. Acute and chronic. It's long term. Each one of them can have a different impact. Usually people can recover from an acute episode, one moment, and then okay, it might leave a mark. You might remember that. You might not go by the bus stop, or go by buses. So it leaves its mark, but you can recover over time. But when it becomes chronic and you have time on it, now the reaction that your body has looks a lot like depression. Because you begin to shut down, you begin to get numb, because you're just waiting for that next moment of getting out of the way of the bus. When do I need to jump? And you become hypervigilant. And all of these things take energy. They take tons and tons of energy to avoid that stressor or to minimize that stressor. And then out of that hypervigilance, you start wanting more control. Like if I do this, or if I put this right here, or if I take a different route. If I say this to this person and that to that person, I can kind of get an idea where that bus is going to be in a little bit. And so you begin to do all these things. Again, more energy, more time. And so depression can start really forming, pretty easily. That's pretty ground for depression. And your body reacts the same way. Now, the interesting thing is when the stressor is removed, how quickly do you recover? How quickly do you come back, to a normal baseline without that stressor there? And for me, okay, so Lori died 10 years ago, and I'm still struggling with it. I still, and again, I go back to you saw my reactions there at times. I have no control over it. I went through this presentation last night, and I was like, good, I got through it, right? I'm thinking, today, I'm going to do this today, right? Nope, I was here, boom, it hit me. I was like, oh, and it just does. And that's part of that stressor. It's getting better, because my recovery time is shorter. There were times where I would get into that spot and it would be 5 minutes, it'd be 10 minutes, and people would be like, okay, you know, I got stuff to do here, guy, you know. It'd take a while for me to recover. So my recovery time is getting shorter. So as a clinician, I self-diagnose, of course. I have no control issues. And so I look at it and I say, hey, well, I am getting better because my response time to recovery is getting shorter.